Hello, gorgeous people. I feel like it's been a while, and every time I've tried to film, something has come up. And I'm taking a real chance. Today is Sunday while I'm filming this. So Nora is downstairs in the basement at the moment with her papa. I'm stealing a moment for myself. So we'll see if we're interrupted in this video. Very possible. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my favorite books of 2023 thus far. I have a whole stack here. There are several books also that I don't physically own. So we're gonna get into it all today. Let's start out with a series that I just fell in love with. I raced through the whole audiobook collection of the series. The start of the series is My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. It's funny because I picked up the series, or the first book in the series, many moons ago. Like, I want to say 5 years ago. Just couldn't get on with it for some reason, and I put it down. Maybe it's the audio, but I just really enjoyed it, and I just sped through it. This is about two girls. We meet them when they're quite young. They stay friends, on and off throughout their lives. And we meet them when they're kids. These two girls live in Italy, and they're very competitive through their whole lives, in school, with boys, with career stuff. They are unbelievably competitive, and it's kind of like, this is how not to be a friend. Truly, the wild nature of their friendship and just the competitiveness of it. I'm glad that I don't have friends like this. I could not have friends like this in my life. But for some reason, they stay true to each other in one way or another. They're just, I don't know, attached at the hip. At the end of the day, they stay friends, even though like everything tells them that they shouldn't be. But I was completely addicted. There's lots of drama in here. There's also a lot to be said about feminism in here. We meet them, I believe it's in the 60s, maybe late 50s, early 60s when we're meeting them. And women are very much told to be a certain thing. And they're questioning that, but also have been kind of indoctrinated by that thought. And so we have these conflicting things going on in their minds. I just think it's a wonderful series, very addictive. The end of the series, I will not spoil anything, but it felt very stark and sudden, and I was kind of left wanting to know more, but it also at the same time was kind of perfect for the series. In any case, really loved that book. Next book, a Sarah Waters that I hadn't read yet. I have a few that I haven't read, and I'm just kind of holding on to them because I don't know when that woman's going to come out with another book. She hasn't come out with a book in, I want to say, over a decade. Oh, anyway, this is The Paying Guests. I loved this one. We meet a woman it's 1922. She lives in London, and she lives with her mom, and her father has recently passed away and left them practically nothing. So they've had this really big house, and they've had to essentially let out, I think, the upper floor. So they now have tenants, and their first tenant is a married couple, Lillian and Leonard Barber. They're a modern couple. They come moving in, and there is some tension and also some friendships that develop. There's a bit of an attraction between Lillian and our main character, whose name is, I'm completely forgetting. In any case, so that is definitely part of this book. Like, the first half of this book truly is about watching that attraction develop. And you guys know me, I don't like romance. I have a hard time with romance in books. However, I was kind of interested to see where it was going to go. That said, I will not spoil anything, but halfway through the book, it takes an enormous turn, enormous twist to the point that it becomes almost like mystery suspense-esque, which you're not really expecting when you go into this book. I love Sarah Waters. I've always loved her. I remember that I read my first book of hers, Affinity, when I was like, oh gosh, I think I was maybe 18, 20, and I haven't looked back. I just adore her as a writer. So please, Sarah, come out with more books. I should mention that this list of books are not in any order. Like, I don't have a like ultimate favorite, although I do, but it's not in any order. Next is Mrs. England by Stacey Halls. This takes place in 1904, and we meet a nurse named Ruby May, and she is charged with looking after the children of this fairly wealthy family. She's going pretty far away from her home, which is nerve-wracking for her. This is the furthest away from home she's been. And she goes to this home, and it's a bit isolated, and Mrs. England, the mother of the kids she's taking care of, is just off. She doesn't seem to connect with her kids. There's a lot of stuff that's just off, and she's wondering why. And she kind of delves into that. At the same time, she has a secret of her own that she doesn't want to reveal. I really liked the atmosphere of this book. It was tense, and the suspense kind of built through it. I really did enjoy this, and it's something that I'll read again. It's one of those things that I feel like I'm forgetting some of the substance of it, but I know that I absolutely loved it while reading it. Isn't that weird how that can happen, that some books, like, you can vividly remember almost everything, and then others you know that you thoroughly enjoyed, and yet things are missing in your mind? I don't know what that's about, but there we have it. Next is a horror. It's How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. No one is surprised that a Grady Hendrix has made it onto the list. If you don't know, he's my favorite horror novelist of all time. He writes scary stories, but also he is so funny in his writing. He loves the horror genre. He loves the campy nature of horror. He just is just a gem to me. I have a few books of his, similar to Sarah Waters. I feel like, you know, I don't know if he's going to come out with another book like next year, so I want to like save some just in case. I shouldn't do that. I should just sit down and read them all. But How to Sell a Haunted House is a very funny and scary story about a woman whose parents die very suddenly in a car accident. So she loses them suddenly, and she has to go home to essentially sell their house. She's going for, of course, the funeral and kind of going through the house and packing up their stuff and working on their affairs. And she's nervous about going back home because she knows her brother is there. And it's in a bit of an estranged relationship. Her parents have always like kind of coveted her brother. He can do no wrong. She just cannot stand the man. Like, she feels like he's a bit of a deadbeat, doesn't do anything. And she has like reached all of these she's achieved all of her goals essentially in life, and she just cannot understand him. And so they do come together, and there's so much silly conflict. Like, it really does feel like sibling conflict. It's really funny. And at the same time, they're going into this house where they know, like, her mom was a big puppeteer. She loved puppets. She belonged to like a puppet society. And there are puppets from her childhood that just creep her out, and for very good reason. And the puppets are still there. And they might cause a little bit of a ruckus. Truly so funny. The first half of the book, you're reading from her perspective. The second half of the book, you're reading from her brother's perspective. I loved that shift happened. I didn't expect it, and I really enjoyed that, and getting his take on growing up with this kind of odd mother. Really, really loved it. The next book I want to talk to you about is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. I read this at the start of the year, and it has stuck with me, and I then went on to read another book by her. She writes very short books, but they pack a punch. This book takes place in, I think, the 80s in Ireland, and we follow a man who has a small family. He's the dad of, I think, several girls, and he I think brings wood or something to different places in this small town that he lives in. And one day he brings wood to a house in which nuns take care of unwed mothers. I think the idea is that they're going to encourage the mothers to put their children up for adoption. He comes across a woman who is struggling in a major way, needs help, and he steps in to help. He was raised by a single mother, and that experience has left an imprint on him. That said, he is living in a small town where people talk, and it's not looked upon very well if you are a single mother, if you are someone who has a child out of wedlock. And so it is his experience also within his own family, dealing with judgment and all of that. And it takes place at Christmas, which is the perfect time for it to take place, because as we all know, Mary had a child, out of wedlock. She had God's child, and how she was treated juxtaposed against how these women are treated is so interesting. It's so interesting. I loved this book. I would recommend absolutely to read this at Christmas. It's not the most uplifting book, but it is heartwarming in a certain way, because he cares. Other people might not care about this woman in particular that needs help, but he truly, truly does, and he steps in the biggest way, and I just loved him through it. So yes, a short book, but man, does it pack a punch. The next book is The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell. This is her latest, and this woman can do no wrong. I really enjoyed this book. It takes place in the 1500s, and we meet a woman, a girl called Lucrezia. She's the daughter of a duke, and her sister is betrothed to a man, and everything is wonderful. They're like getting ready for the wedding, and then her sister promptly dies, and her mother decides that Lucrezia should actually marry this man in the sister's place, which is weird. It's a weird thing. So she does, and while you're reading this book, you're reading about her childhood, and then you're also reading in the present, in her present, where she believes that her husband is about to kill her, and she's trying to get away from him. And this is based upon a true story about a woman who promptly disappears. I think she disappears or she's killed or something along those lines. And everyone thinks that the husband killed her. And like, that was the rumor that went around. It was gripping, and you could feel how imprisoning essentially marriage was for women. If you had a bad marriage, you were stuck in a horrible position at this time. Thank God that's changing, but you know what? Domestic violence still exists, 100%. Next up, oh my goodness, this made me feel so happy. It made me feel like Kate Morton is back in a big way. Homecoming, it's also the perfect name for this book, because Kate Morton is Australian. Now, she lived in England, I believe, for many years. All of the books, I feel like all of the books that she's written are mostly based in England. And she has recently-ish moved back to Australia, and this takes place in Australia. And we follow a family on Christmas Eve. A terrible event takes place to this family, and it goes down in history as being a terrible, terrible murder. And essentially the the male person, I think, stumbles upon the crime scene. So we follow what happens at that time in 1959, and then we flash forwards 60 years later when Jess is living away. She's living in London, and she receives a call that her grandmother Nora, who kind of raised her, really, she loved Nora. So Nora has fallen and it's not looking good. She needs to get home immediately. So she goes home, she's by Nora's side, and she discovers that Nora fell because she was trying to access something in the attic. And she starts going through Nora's things and stumbles upon this terrible crime that occurred, 6 years ago, and realizes that her grandmother was involved in some way or another with this crime. Holy man, I was flipping the pages, but also trying to just like relish every second, because my gosh, this woman wrote such a fun story. And when you find out at the end how the murder occurred, how this whole thing went down, whew, I was just like grinning from ear to ear. I guess that's weird to be doing that, but like, I didn't guess it. I didn't guess what happened. And I do like that when I'm, left out and don't know. I really liked it. Ooh, another scary one. This is a thriller. It's my favorite thriller of the year. Now one of my favorite thrillers of all time. This is The Last Word by Taylor Adams. This follows a woman who is kind of isolated. She lives on a lake, and there's a couple of houses on it, but not many. It's the off season, and she's house sitting as well. I should mention that. She's house sitting. She's kind of getting away from stuff in her own life, and she's like, this is what I need. She has like one neighbor, and the landlord she does talk to, but that's it. Like, she is very much isolated, and she just reads books on her Kindle. And one day, she reads a book that's just horrible. It's a terrible horror book that she's just like, this is the worst horror book I've ever read. So she writes a scathing review. She ends up getting into like a bit of a tiff with the author. The author's basically trying to stick up for himself. This is how I earn my living. Please take down this terrible review that you left. And she's like, no, this was bad, and I read it, and it's fair for me to review it. It goes back and forth. She thinks it's over, and then strange things start happening to her at the house. And she's like, could it be that author doing something to me? And you're like, absolutely not. That's a ridiculous idea. But something is happening to her. Something creepy is happening. And it's got this like home invasion creepiness, but also hilariousness. Like, some of the stuff in here did remind me of Grady Hendrix, and it just felt like Taylor Adams was just having the best time of his life. And I was here for the ride, 100%. Really loved that one. Next up is a sequel to The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. This is All the Broken Places by John Boyne. This follows two members of a family that move from Germany after the war has ended. They move, and they're basically trying to escape their past, because during the war, our main character's father was in charge of Auschwitz and committed horrible crimes, and they're trying to get away from that, essentially, her and her mother. So you meet them at that time, and you also meet our main character, Gretel or Liesel? Yeah, Gretel. Years later, she's in her 90s, living in London in an apartment building. Her husband has died. She's kind of living on her own, and a family moves into the apartment, and she very much ends up having a friendship with this little boy, who's just a sweet, kind boy, and she realizes he's not in a very good home situation, and she starts to feel very protective of him. and is trying to step in but not overstep. And it kind of flashes back and forth between those two things. This is a book in which Gretel is not all good and she's not all bad. You're rooting for her in some ways and you're also questioning her in other ways. And I really liked the complexity of her character and also the complexity of her own feelings and guilt about what happened all those years ago. I really enjoyed learning more about her as a character. Next is thus far my favorite book of the year. This is The Great Believers. Oh my goodness. This follows a group of gay men in the 80s. Our main character is essentially watching his friends around him being told that they have AIDS and dying of AIDS, and he's trying to not get AIDS, and also just trying to grapple with a world in which people don't care that these men are dying at the rate that they are. It's just very unfair, and you care for him so deeply. You also follow a storyline that happens later, years later. We follow a woman whose actual brother died of AIDS and was friends in that friend group. She is in Paris because her daughter has ended up dating this man who is part of a cult, and now her daughter's part of a cult. She's trying to figure out where her daughter is and try to get her daughter back. It's very nerve-wracking for her. She's very protective of her. And it's about these storylines, and I cared so much about all of them. I loved it. I cried reading this. It was wonderful. Okay, next is The Last Lifeboat by Hazel Gaynor. This takes place in the 1940s. We follow two women. Alice King is a librarian. It's World War II, and she feels like she's not doing enough. She's a librarian. How much help is she giving to the war cause? So she decides to sign up to be a woman, someone who helps to transport children. They're trying to get all of the kids out of England because the bombs are dropping. They want to move them to different countries. So they've decided to move them overseas to Australia, Canada, and the US, I believe. She is on a ship that is going to Canada, and it is hit by torpedoes, by German submarines. It's hit, it goes down, and she's in a lifeboat trying to save herself and these children in the lifeboat with her. And then you also meet in 1940 Lily Nichols, who her husband has died in the war. She has two children. She's terrified. These bombs are dropping. And she decides to send her kids away. And those two kids go on this this cruise liner as well. I don't know if it's cruise liner is probably the wrong word. Ship. And it's about how these storylines interweave and the hardship that both of these women are dealing with. And I really loved it. I was gripped by that book. And last but not least is Truth Telling. This is nonfiction. Is that the only nonfiction on this list? I think it is. I listened to this on audio, and it's definitely a book I actually want to listen to again. It is about the Indigenous experience in Canada and just the extreme racism that does exist within Canada. A lot of people think Canada, they're so nice, they're so lovely, and don't know that we had schools, the government, the churches came together and created schools that were essentially there, residential schools were essentially there to kill the Indian. There's a whole movement to do that. And these schools were open for years, decades, and they ended in the 90s, like the 1990s. It's wild. So she speaks to that, and she speaks to women going missing, Indigenous women going missing at like an astronomical rate in comparison to white women. and just the experience in general. I just learned so much to the point that it was too much and I need to re-listen to this book. So I'm going to try to get it out from the library again, because the whole time I literally was saying out loud, wow, and like, I just don't know enough and I should know more. As a white person living in Canada, I just think that that's kind of important. And I really appreciated her perspective. And I think she's written another book called Four Little Indians, something along those lines that I also want to read by her. I loved her voice in it. She just, you could not find any fault with anything that she said. And if anything, it was humbling, and it was also interesting. She spoke to politics in here, Canadian politics, and I also don't know enough about Canadian politics and history and stuff, but I always remember my dad loving Pierre Trudeau, and my grandfather, my poppy, didn't like him, and so they would talk about that. But I had always thought of Pierre Trudeau as being this like wonderful person. And then I read this book and I was like, whoa, wow, that man did some bad things to Indigenous people. So yeah, I want to read that book again. It was incredible and highly recommend it, especially if you are Canadian. I just so highly recommend it. So those are all of the books that I just adored, loved. Interesting to see how many historical fiction books are on this list. That was not a plan. I just kind of have been picking up books very much mood reading. And so it's kind of interesting to see how many historical fiction. It makes me want to read more. So those are the books that I have loved. Let me know in the comments below what books you have just adored this year. Do you think that any of these are going to end up on my top like 10 of the year at the end? Who knows if I'll have a top 10. I'm not going to back myself into a corner and like just label it a 10. I don't know what will be at the end of the year, but it's been a really great reading year so far. And I've read a lot of books as well, more than last year for sure. So that's it. Hope you guys are doing well, and I'll talk with you hopefully very soon. Bye guys.